The fact that the Taliban have attacked the presidential palace really shows, doesn't it, that there's absolutely no chance of them laying down arms anytime soon.
I think it has to be seen in context. You have one brand of the Taliban negotiating in Doha and elsewhere, but at the same time making clear to their cadre that, look, the fight is still on. I mean, much like sort of Western forces or British forces, the Taliban too have a cadre and a constituency that they have to appease. So this cannot be seen as a signal of defeat or surrender, which is perhaps why you will have this tension between fighting and talking, which is a well-known sort of dilemma, if you like, in the history of insurgencies and counterinsurgencies.
But while the Taliban is so fragmented, what does talking to the Taliban actually mean in that respect?
That's a very good question. My own view is that there's a slim majority or a slim minority of the Taliban who are being engaged in Doha at the moment. And the big question mark is, if something does come off Doha over the next year or 2 years, will it be able to be put in effect in southern or eastern Afghanistan, the most troubled areas of the country? That's a big question mark. But it shouldn't take away from the fact that dialogue is absolutely essential at this point of time.
You've spoken to former Taliban members. How possible is compromise, given that these are extremists, and you could say, well, compromise just isn't in their DNA?
I think compromise is possible. I think the Taliban have realized, much like Western forces, that there is no military victory to this fight, that they cannot militarily take Afghanistan back. They are on the back foot as far as the military operations are concerned. And there is a realization that Afghanistan today is a very different country to what it was even a dozen years ago. And hence, on key issues such as the constitution, such as women's rights, human rights, key sticking points for a variety of lobbies around the world, and rightly so, I think you can see that certain elements within the former Taliban movement have sort of changed their views or principles when it comes to these questions.
But what evidence is there of that? What evidence is there of a sort of appetite for a political accommodation?
There is, sort of, if you like, local level evidence, so local ceasefires, certain former Taliban members trying to set up girls' schools, trying to invest in women's universities outside of Kabul, which is a fairly sort of tangible, quantifiable example of a change in principle. This is not to say that the majority of the movement have changed their views. They possibly haven't. But I think a significant minority are trying to demonstrate that the Taliban is also a pragmatic and practical force that can change with the times.
But surely what we've seen, with them calling their new headquarters the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan and flying the Taliban flag and so on, surely that all shows that they haven't really changed that much, have they?
But I think coming back to my first point is the Taliban have an audience of their own. In many ways, negotiations is a bit like a public relations exercise. It's a bit of a dance which they have to keep appeased their own constituencies. So much like Western forces have to keep their publics sort of appeased when it comes to talks with extremists, as you say, or with the Taliban, which is a very hard thing to do for David Cameron or President Barack Obama. Similarly, it is incumbent upon the Taliban leadership to demonstrate to their cadre that, look, we haven't lost the fight. The fact that we're in Doha doesn't mean that we've surrendered. And we've got a flag up there. We've got the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is now, of course, changed, and they had to pull it down. But to make the point that we're not giving up the fight, we're simply engaging in talks.
The top British commander in Afghanistan has said that the West could have talked to the Taliban 2002 and actually got somewhere. How much of a missed opportunity has there been by the West, do you think?
I think it is extremely significant that General Nick Carter has made this statement. And I think it needs to be read in the spirit of admission by the military command, by the highest British military command in Afghanistan, that talks are a good thing and talks are okay. Now, if you look at Nick Carter's own statement that he made to The Guardian, he caveats it himself and says, look, it's much easier to make easy comments on hindsight, right? But having said that, in 2001 and 2002, the political climate simply did not exist for negotiations. Now, there are lots of people in the landscape who work on Afghanistan who will suggest that that was exactly the time to engage the Taliban. They were on the back foot. What should have been done
on the run, he said.
On the run, get them onto the bond process and force a form of Versailles onto them. But in political reality, how would the Labour government then, or President Bush, have done it to an audience or a public who had been very recently be shaken and rattled by the attacks on 9/11?
You think the public wouldn't have bought it?
I don't see it happening. How would you sell the idea of negotiations with a party that hosted Al-Qaeda, that brought down the Twin Towers?
When you were talking to these former Taliban members, did you see in front of you fanatics, or did you see some reasonable men lurking there?
I mean, that's a difficult question, but I think we saw these men as objectively as possible. The context of our interviews were to try and tease out the extent to which the Taliban might have changed on certain viewpoints, rights, human rights, women's rights, their approach to the constitution, the degree to which they would dissociate themselves by Al-Qaeda. And of course, there's a certain part of you that is a personal part of you that is double guessing your own approach to these questions. And there's no doubt about the fact that when you talk to so-called extremists, you do legitimize their stance. There's no way of getting around that. But you do it with the larger picture that this is a necessity. Dialogue is a necessity, and I think there's a wide recognition across the board now, both in Britain and America and other parts of the world, and even those parts of the world that never advocated talks, that talks today are absolutely essential. It is needed for some sort of a amicable withdrawal of Afghanistan, if that is possible at all.
Well, what were they like, though, to talk to?
Not very different from talking to many others in the business of conflict. Deep personal histories. Most of our interviews started with allowing them to talk about themselves, spend a couple of hours telling us who you are, where you come from, about your family life, why did you join the Taliban movement in the first place. A lot of those narratives are fairly compelling, given the situation in Afghanistan in the 1990s and in 2000, 2001. And as I said, I mean, at some level, of course, even while they're sort of walking through their narrative, you can quite easily get hypnotized into their narrative. But I think that is when you've got to be conscious, step outside, look at it objectively, and try to go back to our sort of methodological framework to say is that we're here for a certain reason and to try and stick to that reason.
Keep a distance.
Keep a distance, absolutely. And I think keeping a distance is absolutely essential, and isolating yourself from the personal in dialogues such as this.
Rupra Chaudhuri, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much.